Chapter 1. The World Before Europeans, pre-1492. Long before Europeans arrived, North America was home to a vast and diverse array of indigenous cultures. These societies, often misunderstood or overlooked by European colonists, had developed intricate social structures, rich traditions, and advanced technologies over millennia. In the northeastern forests, the Iroquois Confederacy was a model of political organization, with its complex system of governance and democratic decision-making. Farther south, the Mississippians built large urban centers like Cahokia, with sophisticated trade networks and religious structures based on large earthen mounds. The plains were inhabited by nomadic tribes like the Sioux, who followed the buffalo migrations that sustained their way of life. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans, formerly known as the Anasazi, created elaborate stone dwellings in cliffs, some of which still stand today as remnants of their impressive architectural and societal advancements. The use of irrigation allowed these cultures to thrive in arid environments, sustaining agricultural practices that supported large populations. Across the Americas, these diverse groups developed languages, spiritual systems, and social orders that were deeply connected to the land they inhabited. Farther south in Central and South America, the Maya, Aztec, and Inca civilizations flourished with complex bureaucratic systems, monumental architecture, and scientific advancements. The Maya built towering pyramids and developed one of the most advanced writing systems in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Aztecs, centered in what is now Mexico City, created an empire known for its intricate religious practices and engineering marvels, such as the city of Tenochtitlan. Meanwhile, the Inca, stretching across the Andes Mountains, built an extensive network of roads, terraces, and cities, including the famed Machu Picchu. These civilizations were characterized by their impressive agricultural systems, astronomical knowledge, and sophisticated political hierarchies. Chapter 2. The Age of Exploration and Contact, 1492–1607. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator funded by the Spanish monarchy, set sail across the Atlantic in search of a new route to Asia. Instead, he landed in the Caribbean, on islands inhabited by the Taino people. Columbus's arrival marked the beginning of the European colonization of the Americas, and his subsequent voyages opened the floodgates for European explorers. The Spanish, driven by a mix of ambition for wealth, territorial expansion, and religious zeal, quickly moved to conquer much of Central and South America. Hernán Cortés toppled the Aztec Empire in 1521, while Francisco Pizarro defeated the Inca in 1533, claiming vast regions of the New World for Spain. The arrival of Europeans had devastating consequences for indigenous populations. Diseases like smallpox, to which Native Americans had no immunity, decimated entire communities, with some estimates suggesting that as much as 90% of the indigenous population perished within a century of European contact. In addition to disease, violent conquest, enslavement, and forced labor systems like the encomienda system further displaced and oppressed native peoples. While Spain dominated much of Latin America, other European powers also sought to stake their claim in the New World. The French began exploring Canada, establishing fur trading posts and forming alliances with various Native American tribes in the 16th century. French explorers like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain laid the foundation for what would become New France, a region focused on trade and missionary work rather than large-scale colonization. The Dutch, too, established a presence, founding the colony of New Amsterdam, modern-day New York, in the early 17th century. England's interest in colonizing the New World began later, but it soon sought to establish settlements along the Atlantic coast of North America. Early attempts, such as the ill-fated Roanoke colony in 1587, ended in failure. However, the English persevered, and in 1607 they successfully established Jamestown in Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. The harsh conditions of the early years, marked by starvation and conflict with local Powhatan tribes, nearly led to its collapse. But the introduction of tobacco cultivation by John Rolfe helped stabilize the colony and turn it into a profitable venture. Chapter 3. Colonial America, 1607–1775. Over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, England established 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America, each developing its own economy, culture, and social order. The colonies can broadly be divided into three regions: New England, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies. In New England, colonies like Massachusetts, founded by Puritans in 1620, were shaped by a religious fervor and a sense of community. These settlers sought to create a city upon a hill, a society based on their religious ideals. The economy here was centered on small-scale farming, fishing, and trade, with major ports like Boston emerging as commercial hubs. Education was also highly valued in New England, leading to the establishment of some of the earliest universities, like Harvard, in 1636. The Middle Colonies, including New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, were characterized by religious and ethnic diversity. Pennsylvania, founded by the Quaker William Penn in 1681, became a haven for religious tolerance, attracting settlers from various parts of Europe. The economy of the Middle Colonies was a mix of agriculture and commerce, with cities like Philadelphia and New York City becoming important centers for trade. In the Southern Colonies, such as Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas, the economy was dominated by agriculture, particularly the cultivation of cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. These colonies relied heavily on the labor of enslaved Africans, who were forcibly brought to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. By the late 1600s, slavery had become entrenched in the southern colonies, and a rigid racial hierarchy developed, shaping the social and economic structures of the region for centuries to come. Life in the colonies was marked by a growing sense of autonomy as the colonists developed their own local governments and economies. However, tensions between the colonies and their British rulers simmered beneath the surface. The British government imposed various taxes and trade restrictions on the colonies, which resented being controlled by a distant monarchy. Over time, these tensions would erupt into open conflict, leading to the American Revolution. Chapter 4. The Road to Independence, 1765–1776. The seeds of revolution were planted in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, 1754–1763, a conflict between Britain and France over control of North American territory. While Britain emerged victorious, the war left it with a massive debt, leading the British government to impose new taxes on its American colonies to help cover the costs of the war. The Stamp Act of 1765 and the Townshend Acts of 1767, which taxed paper, glass, and other goods, sparked outrage among the colonists, who famously argued that there should be no taxation without representation. Since the colonies had no representatives in the British Parliament, they believed it was unjust to be taxed by a government in which they had no voice. In response to these taxes, colonial leaders organized protests and boycotts of British goods. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists during a protest in Boston, killing 5 people in what became known as the Boston Massacre. This event further inflamed anti-British sentiments across the colonies. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 marked a pivotal moment in the growing conflict between Britain and the colonies. In protest of the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, a group of colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped an entire shipment of tea into the water. Britain responded by passing the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, which were designed to punish Massachusetts and reassert British authority over the colonies. In 1774, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, where they discussed how to respond to British aggression. Though there was still hope for a peaceful resolution, the colonists began preparing for the possibility of armed conflict. By 1775, tensions had reached a breaking point, and the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at the battles of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. Chapter 5. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. With the outbreak of hostilities, the American colonies found themselves at war with the most powerful empire in the world. Despite their lack of a professional army and the challenges of uniting 13 distinct colonies, the Americans, led by General George Washington, fought bravely against British forces. Early in the war, the Continental Army suffered several defeats, but key victories at battles like Saratoga in 1777 helped turn the tide. The victory at Saratoga also convinced France to enter the war on the side of the Americans, providing crucial military and financial support. In July 1776, the Second Continental Congress took a bold step by declaring independence from Britain. Drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence laid out the philosophical justification for breaking away from Britain, asserting the colony's right to self-governance and stating that all men are created equal. In July 1776, the Second Continental Congress took a bold step by declaring independence from Britain. Drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence laid out the philosophical justification for breaking away from Britain, asserting the colony's right to self-governance and stating that all men are created equal. The war dragged on for several more years, with both sides suffering heavy losses. However, by 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis found himself trapped in a difficult position. After a grueling campaign in the southern colonies, his army became encircled at Yorktown, Virginia, by American forces led by General George Washington and French forces under the Marquis de Lafayette. With no possibility of escape or reinforcement, Cornwallis surrendered to Washington on October 19, 1781, effectively ending major military operations in the war. Although fighting would continue in isolated skirmishes for another 2 years, the victory at Yorktown marked the beginning of the end for British control over the American colonies. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing the independence of the United States. The treaty granted the new nation all the territory east of the Mississippi River, north of Florida, and south of Canada. The Revolution not only secured independence for the 13 colonies, but also inspired other movements for liberty and democracy across the world, from France to Latin America. Chapter 6. The Birth of a New Nation, 1783–1800. With independence secured, the new United States faced the daunting task of creating a functional government. Initially, the country operated under the Articles of Confederation, a loose alliance of states that left most powers in the hands of individual state governments. However, the Articles proved ineffective at dealing with national issues like trade, defense, and currency, as the federal government had little authority to enforce laws or collect taxes. In 1787, delegates from the states convened in Philadelphia to address these problems. Instead of merely revising the Articles, they drafted a new governing document, the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution created a stronger federal government with 3 branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, designed to balance power and prevent any one branch from becoming too dominant. It also provided for a system of checks and balances to ensure accountability. The Constitution was ratified by the states in 1788, and George Washington was unanimously elected the first President of the United States in 1789. Washington's presidency helped stabilize the fledgling nation. His leadership during this period was crucial in navigating early challenges, such as the country's finances, foreign relations, and domestic unrest. In 1791, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, was adopted, guaranteeing individual liberties such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press. Under Washington's presidency, the United States began to solidify its political identity. The country saw the emergence of 2 political factions, the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, who favored a strong central government and an industrial economy, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, who advocated for states' rights and an agrarian society. This division would shape American politics for decades to come. Chapter 7. Expansion and Conflict, 1800–1860. As the new century dawned, the United States began a period of rapid expansion. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson completed the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the country by acquiring a vast tract of land from France that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. This opened the way for westward migration as settlers poured into newly acquired territories, pushing beyond the Appalachian Mountains in search of land and opportunity. The westward movement was fraught with conflict. The United States expansion came at the expense of Native American nations who were forced off their ancestral lands through a combination of treaties, warfare, and forced relocations. The most infamous of these was the Trail of Tears, 1838–1839, in which thousands of Cherokee were forcibly removed from their lands in Georgia and marched to the Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, leading to the deaths of thousands. During this period, the United States also faced foreign challenges. The War of 1812 against Britain, often called the Second War of Independence, tested the young nation's ability to defend its sovereignty. While the war ended in a stalemate, it fostered a sense of national pride and unity, particularly after American forces successfully defended New Orleans under General Andrew Jackson in 1815. Domestically, the issue of slavery became a source of deepening division. In the southern states, the economy depended on plantation agriculture, particularly cotton, which relied heavily on enslaved labor. In contrast, many northern states had begun to abolish slavery and were increasingly industrialized. The tension between free and slave states led to bitter political battles over the expansion of slavery into new territories. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was an early attempt to maintain a balance between slave and free states by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while banning slavery in future territories north of the 36° and 30Z parallel. Chapter 8. The Civil War, 1861–1865. By the mid-19th century, tensions over slavery, states' rights, and economic differences between the North and South had reached a boiling point. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 was the final straw for many Southern states, who feared that Lincoln, an opponent of the expansion of slavery, would seek to abolish the institution altogether. In 1861, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, sparking the Civil War. The Civil War was the bloodiest conflict in American history, pitting the industrialized North against the agrarian, slaveholding South. The war saw major battles such as Gettysburg, Antietam, and Bull Run, and while the South had early successes, the North's superior industrial capacity and larger population eventually wore down Confederate forces. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all slaves in Confederate-held territory to be free, transforming the war into a moral struggle for human freedom. In April 1865, after 4 brutal years of conflict, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the war. The Union had been preserved, and slavery was abolished with the passage of the 13th Amendment later that year. However, the country faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding the South and integrating millions of formerly enslaved people into American society, a period known as Reconstruction. Chapter 9. Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, 1865–1900. The aftermath of the Civil War brought profound changes to the social, political, and economic fabric of the United States. During Reconstruction, 1865–1877, the federal government sought to rebuild the South and extend civil rights to newly freed African Americans. The 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution granted citizenship and voting rights to African American men, and for a brief period, African Americans held political office and participated in government. However, Reconstruction faced fierce opposition in the South. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using violence and intimidation to undermine African American rights and restore white dominance. By 1877, Reconstruction had largely ended, and Southern states implemented Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised African Americans for nearly a century. The late 19th century, known as the Gilded Age, was marked by rapid industrialization, urbanization, and economic growth. Railroads connected the country, factories churned out goods, and cities swelled with immigrants and rural migrants seeking jobs. However, this era of prosperity was also characterized by stark inequalities. The wealth of industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller stood in contrast to the poverty of factory workers and laborers, leading to labor strikes and the rise of movements calling for social and economic reform.